Mauro, 62, was the kind of man who went unnoticed by many, but never by books. A humble doorman at a corporate building, he had maintained the same calm demeanor since day one. He had a rare manner, the kind you don't learn from a manners manual. He always carried a book in his pocket, as if carrying a secret. During the silent dawns, when the city slept and the elevators stopped dinging, he would open its pages carefully. He read as if breathing, slowly, reverently. He had already immersed himself in Graciliano Ramos, Clarice Lispector, and Dostoevsky. For him, reading and wisdom went hand in hand, even when no one was looking. The older residents respected Seu Mauro. They knew that beyond the uniform, there was an underrated man, possessed of a quiet intelligence. He didn't talk much about himself, but he always had a quote on the tip of his tongue, a thought that made us rethink the day. It was the kind of down-to-earth inspiration that doesn't impose itself, only transforms. While others talked about cars, meetings, and dividends, Mauro talked about Machado and the power of books. He didn't reveal himself, but he left clues. A bookmark in his shirt pocket, a passage of poetry scribbled on bread paper. He was an invisible writer, waiting to be read again. On that cloudy Tuesday morning, everything seemed the same, until a new resident entered the building with hurried steps and an impatient look. He was a young executive, the kind with a tailored suit and a cell phone glued to his ear. Seeing Seu Mauro reading a worn book in the lobby, he paused briefly and made a caustic comment. "Are you going to understand anything about this? That's for those who've studied." Mauro looked up, smiled kindly, and simply replied, "Good morning, Doctor." Intellectual prejudice arrived unannounced, disguised as a joke. Others nearby laughed. It was as if the mere fact that a doorman was reading a book was worthy of mockery. The silent humiliation began there. No shouting, no arguing, just short chuckles and sidelong glances. The young man seemed to be amused by the guardhouse doctor as he began to call Mauro. With each new entry into the building, another provocation followed. Sometimes it was a cynical remark, sometimes a scornful look, and little by little, others began to fall for it. The social discrimination, previously veiled, gained ground even among those who had always respected Mauro. But Mauro didn't retaliate. He continued reading during breaks with the same discreet demeanor. I knew that arrogance and lessons often go hand in hand, and that sometimes life answers better than any argument. The invisible writer remained silent, but not for lack of words. The days passed, but the jokes remained. The young executive seemed to take pleasure in reducing Mauro to a comical figure. He called him the philosopher of the gate, or the author of the gate. To each provocation, Mauro responded with a brief smile, without betraying the pain of being the constant target of a subtle yet corrosive prejudice. The cruelest part is that the easy laughter begins to spread. Other employees began repeating the same jokes. The knowing glances in the hallways revealed how much the atmosphere was tainted by arrogance disguised as jokes. Few realized how much this underestimated man had already endured more than just jokes. Even so, Mauro remained steadfast. Reading was his refuge and his resilience. When he sat down at night with a copy of The Old Man and the Sea, for example, it was like having a conversation with Hemingway about dignity. The power of books wasn't just in the stories. It was in the strength to hold one's head high, even when one's soul wanted to shrink. In that modest guardhouse resided a wisdom that many in the penthouse would never see. He was the living portrait of invisible overcoming. A man who had already been awarded for his hidden talent, now labeled with a badge. But he knew poetic justice has its own time. Before donning the navy blue uniform and learning the rules of the gate, Mauro had already made headlines. In the 1990s, he was known in literary circles for his sensitive perspective and profound writing. He was the author of 3 books, one of them award-winning, that discussed memory, identity, and love in times of silence. He was, unbeknownst to him, a master of respect for the simple. But life doesn't go according to the book. When the record label that backed him went bankrupt, he lost his contract. Around the same time, he also lost his wife, who died of a massive stroke. Heartbroken and bills piling up, he watched his career disappear like smoke, and so he accepted a job as a doorman, not out of abandonment, but out of necessity. He never told anyone this, not out of shame, but by choice. Being the invisible writer was less painful than reliving the loss with every question. And deep down, there was a kind of wisdom there. Not all talent needs to scream to exist. Mauro's quiet intelligence was like invisible ink. It only appeared in the right light. Even without readers, he kept writing. On loose papers, old notebooks, even on the backs of delivery receipts. His texts spoke of injustice, of new beginnings, of men who loved in silence. And perhaps that was what kept him going, faith in the power of words, even when the world seemed deaf. On Friday night, the building's lobby was prepared for an elegant welcome for the new tenants. Subtle lights, fine snacks, and residents dressed in sharp attire. Mr. Mauro, as always, was there to organize the flow and maintain order. But that day, he was thrust into the spotlight and the center of embarrassment. The young executive approached with a glass in his hand and a smirk. He saw Mauro holding an old copy of Grande Sertão Veredas and couldn't resist. "At least you've learned to write your own name, right?" The phrase echoed through the room like a disguised slap. Some laughed uncomfortably. Others pretended not to hear. Mauro simply lowered his eyes. It was more than a joke. It was silent humiliation materialized in front of everyone. And what hurt wasn't the comment itself. It was how easily so many accepted it as normal. As if it were absurd for a doorman to like literature. As if books had social class. As if wisdom depended on a badge. But Mauro didn't react. He took a deep breath and returned to his post. This was just another chapter in his story of overcoming adversity. Little did they know that this underrated man had more words in his heart than many there had read in their entire lives. And that, soon, fate would prepare an answer that wouldn't come out loud, but in the headlines. The following Tuesday, the building was visited by representatives from a publishing house for a meeting on the 15th floor. Among them was an elegant, middle-aged woman with a watchful gaze and a calm gait. As she passed through the lobby, her eyes fell on Mauro and lingered there for a second longer. She frowned as if recognizing a face from a striking page. "Are you Mauro Batista, the writer?" Silence fell like a blanket over the reception area. The young executive sitting next to the coffee nearly dropped his cup. The other employees froze, unsure if they had heard correctly. The woman smiled deeply, and Mauro, for the first time in a long time, seemed speechless. She greeted him respectfully and said she was rereading one of his books with her teenage son. She commented on how that book, Wings in the Mud, had touched so many people in the 1990s and was now being rediscovered by young readers. The humble doorman, who until yesterday had been the butt of jokes, was now called by name with reverence. The scene was brief, but definitive. It was there that the roles began to reverse. The invisible writer gained new light, and intellectual prejudice began to melt under the heat of truth. Poetic justice had knocked on the door and entered without asking permission. A few days later, Mauro received a formal invitation from the same publisher. He would be honored at a literary event dedicated to unjustly forgotten Brazilian authors. The handwritten letter called him a necessary voice in times of turmoil. He read it silently, as if savoring a reconciliation with his own destiny. It was a belated recognition, but still welcome. The young executive, who had previously been mocking, listened to the phone conversation and remained silent. He watched as Mauro carefully folded the note and put it in his uniform pocket. For the first time, his eyes held no mockery, but confusion. It was as if he were standing before a mirror that revealed more than he wanted to see, his arrogance and the lesson that would come with it. That night, Mauro went up to the terrace with an old notebook. He jotted down thoughts, fragments of stories, memories from the past. The underestimated man was writing again, now with a new flame, lit by his restored dignity. It was his hidden talent finding its voice again, after years of silence. The whole building began to buzz. The humble doorman, who read without fanfare, was actually an award-winning writer. That story of overcoming adversity didn't come from a movie. It came from the passenger elevator. And little by little, even the most skeptical began to wonder how many invisible Mauros crossed their paths every day, unnoticed. 4 paragraphs of 4 lines each, maintaining an inspiring and human tone. The following week, an article began circulating in literary groups. The writer who became a doorman and never stopped writing. It was an interview published on an independent literature blog, written by a young journalist who had read Mauro's books in college. The text was simple, but it struck a chord. It spoke of prejudice, dignity, and new beginnings. The post went viral. Within days, Mauro was being talked about on social media as an example of invisible overcoming. Comments like, "Respect for the simple," and "a moving story" multiplied. It was as if the entire country had discovered all at once that talent doesn't just reside in palaces. Sometimes it resides in the lobby, with a badge on the chest and wisdom in the eyes. The atmosphere in the building changed. Residents who had previously merely waved began greeting him by name. Some praised the interview, others asked where to find his books. Even the curious janitor asked for help understanding one of the most complex passages of a novel. Reading and wisdom were once again in the spotlight, but now shared. Mauro remained the same: neat uniform, calm voice, serene gaze. But something had changed in the air. Social discrimination seemed to have been dealt a direct blow, and the power of books was showing its strength, not only to teach, but to transform. The invisible writer had gained readers again, and the world, yet another reason to rethink its labels. The transformation was subtle but clear. Some residents began stopping to ask what Mauro was reading. Others left books at the entrance, as if offering coffee, a simple gesture, but full of gratitude. Even colleagues who had previously laughed at his jokes began to listen to him attentively. It was respect for simplicity gaining ground, where before there had been only silence. The janitor, who always claimed to be bad at reading, appeared one day with a worn-cover book. "It's hard, but I'm trying, Mauro," he said with an embarrassed smile. And Mauro, with the patience of a teacher and the humility of someone who has suffered, explained word for word, without rushing. The entrance hall became a classroom, and the silent intelligence became realistic inspiration. Little by little, that place, once filled with judgment and hierarchies, became a hub for impromptu literary gatherings. One resident left a note: "Thank you for reminding us all of the power of books." Another requested a dedication on one of Mauro's old copies. It was as if history were being rewritten, only this time with poetic justice. The young executive? He hurried past, quieter. Now he no longer joked or mocked. He simply observed, as if realizing too late that he'd missed the target. Mauro, for his part, remained the same: kind, discreet, profound. Because those who carry true wisdom don't need to impose themselves. They just need to live and let others awaken. One day, the young executive came down earlier than usual. He stopped in front of the reception, hesitant, looking at Mauro as if carrying something stuck. He tried to form an apology, his voice low and his gaze lost. Mauro heard him, but didn't react with anger, only with the same silence that had always accompanied him. "Sometimes we speak without thinking," the young man murmured. Mauro simply raised his serene eyes and said, "People only see the uniform. They never ask what's behind it." That was all. No shouting, no accusation. And yet, that sentence hurt more than any fiery speech. It was the mirror of arrogance, returned in calm words. It was a confrontation without a raised voice, without an audience, without a fight. But it was remarkable. Mauro didn't need revenge. His life was already the answer. The lesson was there, raw and direct. One's greatness is not measured by the role they perform, but by the dignity with which they walk. And Mauro walked with the firmness of someone who knew the weight of his own worth. At that moment, the executive realized what so many ignore. The strength of everyday heroes lies not in their position or salary. It lies in their stance in the face of injustice. Mauro, the underestimated man, showed that silence also teaches, and that sometimes it's precisely the simple things that teach the essential. It was during a condominium meeting that the idea arose. Why not host a cultural evening with the residents themselves? The suggestion came from a new resident who had read Mauro's interview and was captivated by his career. The building manager agreed. The board supported it, and the event was soon scheduled. But what no one expected was that Mauro would be the evening's guest of honor. The invitation was delivered with formality and care. The poster read, "Meeting with Mauro Battista, author of Asas na Lama and other touching stories." In the building's auditorium, chairs were arranged, lights adjusted, and even a small table with his books was set up. Mauro arrived in a simple suit, with the same book in his pocket as always, and the look on his face of someone who had finally been seen. During the event, he read a previously unpublished excerpt from his new novel. His calm voice filled the space like music. Wisdom sometimes lives in the lobby, not in the attic. Silence. Tears filled the eyes. The power of books once again transcended status, prejudice, and labels. It wasn't just a speech, it was a wound being healed collectively. At the end, there was applause, standing applause, including from the executive, now seated in the last row. Mauro thanked them humbly and with a slight smile. He needed no trophies or formal apologies. His recognition came not from vanity, but from truth. And truth, when it finds its right moment, transforms even the coldest walls into fertile soil. Never judge a reader by their uniform, nor a book by its cover. Mr. Mauro's story reminds us that often the greatest wisdom lies where it's least expected, that reading and wisdom don't have badges, and hidden talent doesn't cease to exist just because it's been ignored for a while. Mauro never needed to prove anything. His quiet intelligence, his respect for simplicity, and his faith in the power of books were stronger than any joke. He didn't play the victim, he played the bridge. And by crossing that bridge, many discovered that behind every humble gatekeeper can lie an entire universe of experiences and realistic inspiration. This story of overcoming obstacles isn't just about an award-winning writer turned doorman. It's about how we treat others, about how arrogance and lessons almost always go hand in hand, and how intellectual prejudice can silence talent but never erase it. Because what's true always rereads. Have you ever been underestimated for seeming too simple? Have you ever had your light hidden because of your uniform, your accent, or your role? Comment below and tell us your story. We want to hear from you. And also tell us, from which city or country are you watching our channel? If this story touched your heart, like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. We have many other stories that inspire, move, and transform.